What if I told you that once upon a time, the Spanish Empire, the colossus upon which the sun never set, a realm stretching from the cold silver veins of to the burning stones of Manila, was ruled by a man so frail, so grotesquely deformed that his very existence was interpreted as a living curse? His name was Charles II of Spain, and his people called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. They whispered that no natural hand could have sculpted such a creature. The nobility crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. And even seasoned diplomats from foreign courts returned home with stories that sounded less like political reports and more like ghost tales. Tales of a monarch whose body bore the marks of the devil, whose reign seemed less a government than a prolonged act of divine punishment. But here is the unsettling truth. Charles was not bewitched by sorcery, nor cursed by demons in the night. His condition was the consequence of something far more chilling, far more deliberate: a dynasty that consumed itself in its hunger for power. The House of Habsburg, masters of Europe for nearly 2 centuries, had for generations sealed marriages not with strangers, but with their own blood, cousins with cousins, uncles with nieces, a great family tree whose branches had twisted back upon themselves, until the fruit that grew was rotten at the core. Charles was the final harvest of that poisoned orchard. By the time of his birth in 1661, Spain was already a kingdom in twilight. The golden age of conquistadors and explorers had given way to endless wars, debt, and famine. The wealth of the Americas poured in still. Yes, but like water into a cracked vessel, much was wasted, siphoned into wars with France, into luxuries that masked decline, into keeping an empire too vast to manage. Spain still bore the glitter of majesty, but underneath, rot was spreading. And then into this fragile world came a king whose body itself was a ruin. Imagine the scene. The royal cradle of Madrid, hung with silks and watched by the most powerful nobles of the realm. And within it, the heir of Spain, an infant, pale and feeble, unable to suckle properly, his skull oddly shaped, his tiny lips slack as though already too tired to hold life. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Courtiers lowered their eyes. But none dared say aloud what all suspected, that this was not the child of promise, but the herald of calamity. The people called him El Hechizado. And in the candlelit chambers of the Escorial, where superstition mixed freely with politics, whispers spread like wildfire. Was this the devil's doing? Or perhaps God's judgment upon a dynasty too proud to heed natural law? But the real culprit was not supernatural. It was genetic inevitability. For 200 years, the Habsburgs had been rolling dice with their own bloodline. To them, purity was not a virtue, was a weapon, a way to keep power concentrated in one family. Yet every roll of the dice carried a hidden cost. And with Charles, the dice had landed on ruin. His reign, spanning nearly 4 decades, would become one long testament to this grim experiment, a demonstration of how power, when hoarded too jealously, can destroy its own foundations. By the time of his death in 1700, Charles would not only have extinguished the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, but also set the continent ablaze in a war that would kill hundreds of thousands. His life was a tragedy written in bone and blood, each chapter more unsettling than the last. And it begins with the jaw that could not close. When foreign ambassadors first met Charles II, they often struggled to hide their shock. Here was the King of Spain, Lord of the New World, heir to an empire where gold and silver flowed like rivers, and yet his mouth hung open, slack and useless, as though the very machinery of his body had forgotten its purpose. His lower jaw protruded grotesquely, jutting forward so far that his lips could never meet. It was said you could slip a coin between his teeth, even when he tried to close his mouth. This deformity was not an accident, nor a random misfortune. It was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a condition bred into the dynasty through centuries of incestuous unions. Doctors call it mandibular prognathism, but for the Spaniards who served him, it was simply another mark of the curse. A king who could not shut his mouth seemed almost a parody of authority and emperor, whose every word dribbled out in slurred, wet syllables, a sovereign whose body betrayed him with each breath. Every meal was an ordeal. Royal kitchens were forced to grind and mash his food until it resembled baby's gruel. Even then, soups leaked down his chin, and solid food slipped out as though rejected by his own mouth. At banquets, those glittering displays meant to dazzle visiting envoys. Charles's presence turned triumph into embarrassment. Servants hovered constantly with cloths to dab saliva, while nobles stared rigidly at their plates, trying to pretend their sovereign was not sputtering and drooling beside them. But perhaps the cruelest humiliation was not his eating, but his speech. The same deformity that warped his jaw also mangled his words. Foreign ambassadors, baffled, often required interpreters, not because they did not know Spanish, but because they could not decipher the slurred murmurs of the man who ruled Spain. Imagine the irony. A king whose voice was meant to command armies, issue decrees, proclaim treaties, reduced to an almost childlike mumble, intelligible only to those closest to him. His mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, confessed her deepest fear in letters, that her son might one night choke to death on his own tongue. And indeed, the sight of him struggling to breathe, to swallow, to form simple sentences, was a constant reminder to his court of how fragile their monarch truly was. But the Habsburgs knew, long before Charles, that their marriages were producing damaged heirs. The warning signs were there in cousins born weak, in nephews plagued with seizures, in nieces who died before reaching maturity. Yet they continued. Why? Because to them, the risk of deformity was preferable to the greater risk of losing power. To marry outside the bloodline was to admit weakness, to risk that precious Habsburg inheritance might slip into other hands. And so, century after century, they tightened the circle, until Charles II was born into a genetic labyrinth so narrow that escape was impossible. His body was not just his own, it was a living testament to dynastic arrogance, to an empire that believed itself untouchable, even by nature itself. To the outside world, he was a monarch, cursed by the devil. But to history, he was something far more unsettling, the natural outcome of a family that had chosen pride over survival. And his jaw, forever open, became the emblem of that choice, a mouth that could not close, as if mocking the silence of a dynasty doomed to swallow its own ruin. To understand why Charles II was born broken, one must first peer into the twisted branches of his family tree. The House of Habsburg, once the most dazzling dynasty in Europe, had elevated inbreeding into a political weapon. Where other royal houses occasionally married cousins for convenience, the Habsburgs did so obsessively, as though determined to keep every drop of their blood imprisoned within the same veins. Charles's own parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents on both sides were also uncle and niece. Generations of repeated unions had folded the same handful of ancestors into the family line again and again, until Charles was less a child of two parents than the product of centuries of narrowing possibilities. Historians calculating his ancestry have shown that more than 90% of his genetic material came from just a few repeated forebears. In essence, Charles was the heir of a kingdom, but with the genetic diversity of an isolated islander cut off from the world. This obsession with blood purity was no accident. The Habsburgs ruled not only Spain but also Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast swaths of the New World. Power was their lifeblood, and they believed that only by marrying within the family could they prevent rival dynasties from laying claim to their thrones. To dilute the bloodline was to risk dismembering the empire. And so, cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, until what should have been the tree of a great dynasty became a coiled serpent devouring its own tail. In Madrid's grand halls, these unions were celebrated as triumphs of dynastic strategy. But in the whispers of the people, they were something darker. Villagers who toiled under the crown's taxes muttered that the royal family was cursed. Priests worried aloud that such unnatural marriages invited God's wrath. Even physicians of the era, who knew little of modern genetics, suspected that such relentless inbreeding weakened the blood, and yet the Habsburgs persisted. Perhaps they thought themselves above the laws of nature, as untouchable as the empire they ruled. But nature cannot be defied forever. Charles II was not the first Habsburg to show signs of degeneration. But he was the culmination, the final proof of what happens when power is hoarded so jealously that it suffocates its heirs. Look at his face in portraits, and you see it. The jutting chin, the heavy lower lip, the slack jaw. No. But what you do not see is the weight of ancestry pressing down upon him. The invisible burden of centuries of marriages that turned love into calculation and children into pawns. His very body was a mirror, reflecting the shadows of his bloodline. And as he grew from a sickly infant into a frail boy, those shadows deepened, preparing Spain for a tragedy it could neither foresee nor prevent. Charles entered the world already fragile, but his childhood revealed just how deeply broken his body truly was. Most children take their first steps before their first birthday. Charles did not walk until he was 8. For nearly a decade, the heir of Spain had to be carried. Cradled like an infant long after he should have been running through palace halls. Servants whispered that he was more a doll than a buoyant object to be moved and displayed, but not one capable of life's simplest motions. When he did at last attempt to walk, it was not the proud stride of a future king, but a stumbling shuffle, his spindly legs trembling beneath him. Palace records describe him clinging to walls, groping at furniture, lurching from one support to the next like an elderly man robbed of strength. His head, disproportionately large and heavy, bobbed upon a neck too weak to hold it. His limbs seemed skeletal, as though stretched by some cruel hand, while his torso compressed and hunched unnaturally. The sight was disturbing. In an age where physical presence was inseparable from majesty, the boy king looked less like a monarch in waiting than a cruel parody of one. His silhouette, hunched and misshapen, gave the impression of a child staggering under an invisible load. And in truth, he was the accumulated weight of centuries of Habsburg arrogance pressing down upon his fragile bones. Physicians of the court prescribed endless remedies, tinctures of exotic herbs from the Indies, charms whispered over his cradle, prayers at shrines of saints. Nothing worked. Some suggested bathing him in the blood of animals. Others recommended alchemical concoctions to strengthen the humors. All failed. Science, such as it was in the 17th century, could not explain what they were seeing. A living heir whose body itself was at war with him. To the courtiers who watched, Charles's infirmities seemed like an omen. Spain was still a giant upon the map, its territories spanning oceans, but here in its heart beat weakness. Soldiers returning from wars in Flanders, peasants crushed by taxes, and nobles desperate to preserve their privileges looked at the sickly prince and saw a kingdom destined for ruin. Even within the palace walls, superstition thrived. Servants crossed themselves when Charles was carried past. Some whispered he was being punished for the sins of his forefathers. Others believed dark forces had twisted him in the womb. The Queen Mother clung to hope, but in her private letters she admitted her dread that her son might not survive to adulthood, that God had given her Spain's crown but denied her Spain's heir. Yet Charles survived. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. For all his fragility, for all his stumbling weakness, he continued to live, defying predictions. Each breath seemed miraculous, and each year he survived only deepened the impression that he was not merely a sick child, but a living portent. He was a boy who should not have walked, yet did. A prince who should not have lived, yet lingered. And as he grew into adolescence, his body carried the unmistakable signs that his suffering would only deepen that this child, against all odds, was destined to wear a crown he could never truly bear. By the time Charles reached adulthood, his body had become a grotesque parody of kingship. He stood barely 5 feet tall, and yet his head loomed unnaturally large, a swollen crown upon a withered frame. His spine curved so severely that he seemed permanently hunched, as though bowed beneath a burden no man could carry. His limbs were thin, almost skeletal, dangling awkwardly from a torso that appeared compressed, misshapen, and weak. He did not walk with dignity, but shuffled, lurching from one piece of furniture to another. His gait that of an old man robbed of vitality rather than a sovereign at the height of his power. Observers remarked that he seemed weighed down by his very existence, each step an act of defiance against a body determined to betray him. Nor was his appearance any less unsettling above the shoulders. His hair grew in patchy, brittle clumps, falling out in irregular tufts so that his scalp resembled the pelt of a diseased animal. Even the most flattering portraits, painted with the full indulgence of royal flattery, could not entirely disguise the truth. The King of Spain looked less like a monarch and more like a living ruin. The court tried to mask these realities. Tailors designed garments to conceal his deformities. Painting studios labored to soften the lines of his twisted face. But rumors could not be silenced. Foreign envoys wrote to their masters describing a king whose very body was an indictment of his dynasty. His Majesty, wrote one ambassador, resembles a shadow more than a man. And one trembles to think such a form can contain a soul. Today, medicine might recognize in Charles's condition the signs of multiple disorders: hydrocephalus, rickets, pituitary deficiencies. In his time, however, such terms were unknown. To his people, he was simply cursed, whether by God for the sins of his forefathers, or by sorcery at the hands of enemies. And within the palace, both explanations held terrifying sway. But the worst was not merely what Charles looked like. It was what his deterioration symbolized. A monarch was supposed to embody his realm majestic, commanding, strong. Yet Spain's king was visibly crumbling before his courtiers' eyes, a reflection of an empire itself unraveling beneath the weight of endless wars, famine, and debt. Every audience with him was a reminder that Spain's mightiest symbol of authority was trapped in a body that could neither command respect nor inspire fear. His frailty was more than personal misfortune, it was political catastrophe. The empire's strength was embodied in a man whose body was failing faster than he could live. And as the years passed, one truth became unavoidable. This was not a body destined to rule, but a body destined to collapse. A body in revolt against itself, dragging down with it the fortunes of the greatest empire on earth. If Charles's body was frail, his mind was scarcely stronger. Though he lived to see his late 30s, Kay carried the intellect and emotions of a child, trapped in the shell of a man expected to rule an empire. Tutors despaired, describing him as a vessel with cracks that no knowledge could fill. Lessons were forgotten within hours. He did not learn to read until the age of 10. And even then, he struggled with the simplest comprehension. His handwriting was clumsy, his memory unreliable, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Yet his condition was more than mere slowness, it was volatility. At times, Charles could erupt in sudden tantrums, shrieking with rage over trifles, pounding his fists like a boy denied his toys. At other times, he would lapse into eerie silence, sitting motionless for hours, staring at nothing as though his mind had wandered into a void from which it could not return. To the courtiers surrounding him, these moods were not only unsettling, but dangerous. Spain was a kingdom beset by crises, wars in the Low Countries, rebellions in Naples, financial ruin looming like a storm. And yet the sovereign to whom all decisions ultimately flowed was as unpredictable as a fevered child. Behind closed doors, power shifted to his regents and advisors. His mother, Queen Mariana, acted as guardian and de facto ruler for much of his early reign, while ministers and confessors vied for influence over the fragile monarch. Rival factions at court whispered and schemed, each using Charles's incapacity as both shield and weapon. Decisions were delayed, decrees issued in his name but drafted by others. Spain's crown had become not a source of authority but a mask worn by those clever enough to maneuver behind it. And still, Charles was not entirely oblivious. Accounts describe a man dimly aware of his limitations, haunted by his inability to meet the simplest expectations of kingship. His outbursts were often followed by sobbing fits, his confusion by bitter withdrawal. One chronicler wrote that the king seemed at times to know he was but a child playing at majesty, and the knowledge gnawed at him like a hidden wound. What made this tragedy more piercing was the contrast. The empire he inherited was vast beyond imagination, galleons carrying treasure across oceans, its armies feared across Europe, its priests spreading faith across continents. And yet at its center sat a monarch who could neither command nor reason, a king in name whose crown weighed heavier than he could bear. His subjects whispered of demons, of curses, of bewitchment. But the truth was simpler and far sadder. Charles II was a child who never grew up, condemned to wear a crown that turned his weakness into the weakness of a kingdom. For Spain, salvation depended on one desperate hope, that Charles II, frail though he was, might sire a son. A single heir could preserve the dynasty, bind the empire together, and silence the whisper that the Habsburg line was doomed. But in this, as in so much else, the king's body betrayed him. At 18, Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Nice of Louis XIV of France. She was young, radiant, and, by all accounts, kind-hearted. The court hoped her presence would strengthen him, that her youth might inspire vigor where weakness reigned. But what followed was humiliation. The marriage remained childless, year after year. Physicians were summoned, saints were prayed to, relics pressed against the queen's womb. Still, the cradle stayed empty. Behind closed doors, the truth was whispered in tones of pity and disgust. Charles was impotent. His body, already twisted and sickly, could not fulfill the most basic duty of a monarch to produce an heir. Marie-Louise herself suffered deeply. Letters from foreign ambassadors describe her as miserable, trapped in a gilded cage beside a husband more specter than man. She is said to have wept constantly, her laughter gone, her beauty fading under the weight of despair. In 1689, at just 26 years old, she died suddenly, some said of appendicitis, others of poison, but many believed of heartbreak. Charles remarried the following year, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen for her family's reputation for fertility. She came from a line of women who bore children easily and often, but again, the union was barren. For Charles, this failure became an obsession. He believed himself cursed, bewitched by enemies who sought to deny him an heir. In desperation, he ordered exorcisms and permitted priests to perform rituals upon his body. Holy water was sprinkled over his bed, sacred relics placed beneath his pillow, Latin prayers whispered into his ears as he slept. At one point, his confessors ordered his hair and fingernails burned to drive away demonic influences. Nothing worked. Each attempt ended the same, with a king staring into the void of his own inadequacy, and a nation realizing the cradle would never be filled. By the late 1690s, it was undeniable. The last Habsburg of Spain would die childless. The line that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries, an empire stretching across oceans, richer than any in Europe, was about to end with a man who could barely walk, barely think, and could not father a child. And with that realization, the vultures began to circle. France, Austria, England all eyed the Spanish crown, waiting for Charles's inevitable death to ignite a war that would engulf Europe. The king himself, trapped in superstition and despair, became less a ruler than a pawn. His body had already betrayed him. Now, even his crown was slipping from his hands. By the final decade of his life, Charles II no longer resembled a monarch, but a living relic, an object of pity, dread, and superstition. His body wasted away, his skin ashen, his teeth rotting in their gums. He coughed blood, suffered seizures, and often could not eat without choking. Courtiers described him as a cadaver upon the throne, a king who seemed already half buried. And yet, for Spain, his survival was both curse and necessity. Each year he lingered without an heir. The question of succession grew darker, and foreign powers grew bolder. Ministers clung to him as a drowning man clings to driftwood, even as his presence only prolonged the inevitable. In this atmosphere of dread, the line between medicine and sorcery dissolved. Physicians were powerless, their treatments useless. Priests and confessors stepped into the void, insisting that the king's ailments were not natural but infernal. Enemies had bewitched him, they claimed. His sterility, his madness, his weakness all signs of a diabolical curse. And so began rituals that belonged less to the halls of power than to the chambers of an inquisition. Charles submitted himself to exorcisms, lying on the cold stone floors of monasteries as friars chanted incantations over his trembling body. He drank potions brewed from sacred herbs, bathed in water, blessed by relics. Endured fasting and flagellation in the hope of purging the evil within him. The most grotesque of these rites came in 1698, when inquisitors, convinced he was possessed, ordered a necromantic diagnosis. Charles's fingernail clippings, hair, and even his clothing were burned. The smoke studied for signs of enchantment. The results, predictably vague, confirmed the worst. The king was indeed bewitched. From that moment, the monarchy's desperation sank into madness. Charles was forced to undergo one final exorcism so violent that witnesses claimed he writhed on the ground like a man in flames, howling as if his very soul were being torn from him. The ritual left him shattered. Within weeks, his decline accelerated beyond hope. When physicians performed an autopsy after his death in 1700, their findings only deepened the aura of dread. His body, they reported, was grotesquely deformed within as without. His heart was the size of a grain of pepper, his intestines rotted, his lungs consumed, his testicles shriveled and black as coal. It was as if nature itself had turned against him, stripping away every vestige of vitality until nothing remained but a warning. The death of Charles II was not merely the end of a man, it was the death knell of a dynasty. With him perished the Spanish Habsburgs, consumed by centuries of pride, incest, and superstition. His passing lit the fuse for the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would convulse Europe for over a decade. And so in the last withered body of a broken king, one can read the fate of an empire, a ruin that had once spanned continents undone. Not by enemies alone, but by the slow, relentless poison of its own bloodline. In the twilight of his life, Charles II lingered more as an omen than a ruler. His frame was skeletal, his eyes hollow, his voice a rasp that seemed to echo from some cavern deep within. The court had grown accustomed to waiting for his death, as men wait for the final toll of a funeral bell. Yet in those last years, one question devoured Europe's attention. Who would inherit Spain's dying empire? The issue was no mere matter of dynastic etiquette. Spain's dominions were vast, stretching from the mines of Peru to the castles of Naples, from the silver fleets crossing the Atlantic to the Catholic strongholds in Flanders. Whoever inherited this crown would hold in his hands the balance of Europe itself. Two great claimants loomed like predators over a wounded stag. On one side stood France, embodied by Louis XIV, Sun King, whose grandson Philip of Anjou was the closest Bourbon heir. On the other side, the Austrian Habsburgs, cousins to Charles, demanded the empire remain within their bloodline. Behind them, England, the Dutch Republic, and the German states waited, each ready to tip the scales, each fearing that too great a prize would fall into the hands of one rival. Charles himself, dimly aware of the weight of his decision, became the battlefield upon which Europe's diplomacy raged. Ambassadors swarmed Madrid, whispering promises, threats, and bribes. Priests reminded him of his duty to defend Catholic unity. Ministers plotted in shadowed corridors, seeking advantage in the succession as vultures circle a dying beast. Yet the king was not without his own will. In October of 1700, as his strength ebbed to its last flicker, Charles dictated a testament that would shatter the uneasy balance of Europe. He left the whole of Spain's empire to Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's Louis XIV. "I desire," he declared, "that our monarchy remain entire, under a prince of the House of Bourbon, for thus will it be preserved." It was both a choice and a surrender. With those words, Charles extinguished 2 centuries of Habsburg rule in Spain and handed its inheritance to the Bourbons. But in doing so, he ensured that Europe would not rest. To England and Austria. The thought of Bourbon France and Bourbon Spain united under one family was intolerable, a threat to the very balance of Christendom. Charles II died on the 1st of November, 1700, All Saints' Day. Bells tolled across Madrid, not in triumph, but in dread. For all knew what would follow. Within months, war erupted, war not for Spain alone, but for the fate of Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession raged for over a decade, drowning the continent in blood and fire. And at its root lay the shriveled heart of a man who had never truly lived, yet whose death reshaped the world. Thus ended the story of Charles the Bewitched, a king cursed by his own blood. A child in a crown too heavy to bear, and the final echo of a dynasty undone by its own pride. Charles II was buried with the solemn grandeur befitting a king, yet even in death he inspired little reverence. His funeral cortege wound through Madrid like the passage of a shadow, a procession not of triumph but of exhaustion. Spain had carried him as one bears a burden, and now it was left only with silence and the thunder of war rising on the horizon. History has judged him harshly. To many, Charles was the very image of decay, the withered fruit of generations of incest, a monarch incapable of speech or siring heirs. A body so diseased that even the doctors recoiled at its autopsy. He has been called the most pitiful king ever to sit upon a throne, the last grotesque bloom of a dynasty that had once ruled the world. Yet his story is more than the tale of a single broken man. It is the story of empire itself, how power, if hoarded and sealed away within a single bloodline, can rot from the inside. The Spanish Habsburgs, who once commanded oceans and armies, who claimed dominion over continents, collapsed not in a single battle, but through centuries of arrogance, superstition, and self-inflicted ruin. Charles II became their mirror. His twisted frame reflected the twisted legacy of his house. His infertility echoed the barrenness of an empire drained of vitality. His paranoia, his endless exorcisms and desperate rituals, embodied a nation so entangled in ghosts and curses that it could no longer confront reality. And yet his shadow lingers. Even in his weakness, Charles changed the course of Europe. By leaving his crown to the Bourbons, he lit the spark of a war that reshaped kingdoms, alliances, and borders. Out of his death came a new Spain, poorer and weaker, but tethered to France, its fate forever altered. Today, when one walks through the dim corridors of the Escorial, where kings of Spain lie entombed in marble, the ghost of Charles II seems to whisper from the crypt, not with the majesty of his forebears, but with the brittle voice of warning, that no dynasty, no empire, no bloodline, however powerful, is immune to the slow poison of its own flaws. Thus ends the tale of Charles the Bewitched, the Child King, the cursed monarch, the last Habsburg of Spain. A man remembered less for what he did than for what he embodied, the twilight of an empire, and the eternal truth that power, when corrupted by its own pride, devours itself.